Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming in such a big group. I hope you can hear me. Is that okay? Well, one thing, because there are so many of you, which is amazing, but it's a long symposium. If people want to sit at the front a bit more rather than stand up, we're happy to move the table forward. Is that if people are interested, let's move that. We don't need that much space. It's wonderful to see so many of you, so I guess it's a positive thing. Let's do that, and then we can have a line or two line of seats, I think, at the front if people want that. Open the windows. Open the windows too, yes, sure. In terms of the air. Right, we have another tiny issue that the kind of presenter view, as you might have just noticed, isn't working too well. So in terms of the bios of us and our wonderful participants here, I kind of have to do it reading up. Okay. Is that okay? So warm welcome to everybody to our symposium on the value of real-world evidence in psychedelic research. My name is Katrin Schlag. I'm head of research at Drug Science, also acting CEO at the moment. Drug Science is a charity founded by Professor David Nutt in 2010 upon his sacking by the ACMD, the Advisory Committee on the Misuse of Drugs in the UK. Why was he sacked? He was sacked for comparing the harms of different drugs in a scientific manner, in a rational, evidence-based manner, and really showing that one of the most harmful drug in relation to both the individual as well as the society is alcohol, rather than psychedelics, which, for example, as we're here. So this is why he was sacked. So he started Drug Science, so to keep on telling the truth about drugs, to develop the scientific evidence and communicate this appropriately. I'm joined in this symposium by my colleague, Professor Michael Linsky, epidemiologist from New Zealand, who's worked both in the UK, in the US, in Australia, and so on. He's a head statistician of our project T21, our big medical cannabis database, of which he's going to speak a little bit later as well. And one wonderful colleague, as well as Dr. David Erritzoe. Professor David Nutt, by the way, sends his apologies. He's on his way to Japan now. He is well, so thanks for everybody for asking. He's doing very well, thank God, but he is just incredibly busy as usual. So David Erritzoe is David Nutt always calls him a colleague, a replacement anyway. So that's why he's here, and he's just as wonderful as David Nutt, you will see. He's a clinical senior lecturer and consultant psychiatrist at Imperial College and at the Mental Health NHS Foundation Trust. He conducts psychopharmacological research using brain imaging techniques such as PET and MRI. Some of you will have seen his previous presentation. And he also, I think that's very, very interesting, especially for us in the UK. In 2021, David set up the NHS space. NHS is the National Health Service, state-funded, so to say, psychopharmacology and psychedelic research clinic at St. Charles Hospital in London, named the Cypress Clinic, and doing some amazing work. And apart from that, he's also a very valued member of our medical psychedelics working group. This is Drug Science, which I just mentioned. I wanted to say a few words on our medical psychedelics working group, because this is kind of our connection to the Mind Foundation as well. Mind are one of our supporting partners, so still waiting for Henrik to actually give a talk there. We're a consortium of scientists, academics, policymakers, charities, importantly also patient groups, and obviously industry partners, believing that the future of psychedelic medicine is extremely promising and that there's potential for widespread application of psychedelic drugs within public health models. And really, our overall aim, we've got loads of sub-aims obviously as well, is to break down the barriers of 50 years of medical censorship by creating really a rational and enlightening approach to psychedelic research and clinical treatment. And the aim is to find a balance between the need for further research, and I think we can all agree on, as well as the need for patient access, for patients in desperate need for new treatments. And really, the aim is, how can we further develop the scientific evidence base? And I think in that kind of sense, our symposium really fits very well with the discussions that were held yesterday, for example, at the introduction at mind as insight in terms of really connecting the dots and hopefully showing a way or one way forward. So I'm going to, before my colleagues are going to speak about the more detailed aspects of trials or real-world evidence as well, I'm going to give a brief overview of randomized controlled trials, the limitations for psychedelic research specifically, before highlighting how we can move forward and indeed how the world is already moving forward. So big thank you really for Insight, for inviting us and for letting us host this symposium. A quick point as well. The way we've scheduled this symposium is that we're going to give our presentations, 20-minute max. So we have half an hour for Q&A, panel discussions, online moderation, and so on. So please do bear with us. Do note down any questions now because we'll have them for afterwards, hopefully. My conflict of interest. So just to go back into the randomized controlled trials in clinical research generally, just leaving apart psychedelics just for a moment. As in medicines generally, RCT is obviously considered the gold standard for developing the evidence on psychedelics. And whilst this obviously has a very valuable point, the presumption that RCTs, randomized controlled trials, are free from all sources of bias is generally today considered false, because RCTs involve very complex processes from randomizing, blinding, controlling variables, implementing treatment, monitoring participants, following up with participants, etc., etc. And that require many difficult and complex decisions at different levels, at each step really, by researchers, by clinicians, and by data analysts as well. So all of us have are potentially bringing our own sort of biases towards the research. And as researchers, scientists, as clinicians as well, as we heard earlier on, it's very important just to be humble and to be aware of these kind of biases we might bring. Limitations that are general to RCTs, as well as psychedelic RCTs, obviously, is very often their lack of ecological validity. By nature of their design, RCTs have to have extensive exclusion criteria in terms of the comorbidities or comorbidity of patients, in terms of the other medication use of patients, and so on. You're probably all familiar with that. So the idea, so the issue is that there's often limited generalizability to the non-clinical settings, to the real world. In addition to that, RCTs are obviously cost and very time-consuming, often prohibitively so. And there is, in many ways, a limited long-term results. 6 weeks are kind of normal in psychedelic trials, so it's 12 weeks. We have some longer-term results, but really some of the questions we still need to see answered in terms of psychedelics, in terms of how long-lasting the results are. Is it necessary to dose again after 6 months, and so on. We really need 1 year or 2 year follow-up for that. Limitations that I would say are certainly more specific to psychedelic research is the small sample sizes to date. Obviously, that's work in progress. Most of us will be familiar with the larger scale trials from Compass Pathways now, and who have launched multi-site and much larger trials by now as well. But clearly, psychedelic trials also face further challenges, which we could term extra pharmacological factors, and they play a particular role. These are related to blinding or unblinding and expectancy of participants, as well as of researchers to an extent. And in psychedelic trials, using full doses at least, expectancy and blinding issues cannot be avoided fully, really, because the effects are too noticeable, and also the current social climate is too vivid. Psychedelics are talked about, psychedelics are in the normal print media, and so on. There is a hype, or the Michael Pollan effect, which has been the last few years as well. The nocebo effect in control arms can be very pronounced, and there isn't really a particular consensus yet regarding the gold standard placebo for psychedelic research, and very often this is associated by overinterpretation of efficacy due to various confounders. So the efficacy in the clinical trials is not necessarily the same as the effectiveness in non-clinical settings. And hence why we argue that we also have to look into kind of the real-world effectiveness to really show how psychedelic medicines might actually be used in the real world. Most of you will be familiar with Edo Hartog's excellent analysis of the unique interplay of substance, set, and setting in psychedelics. So psychedelic therapy is clearly not only about the substance, about the drug, but really based on a very complex interaction of patients, of therapists, the therapeutic approach or approaches, session preparation, integration, and many other contextual factors, the mode of preparation, any religious approaches, applications, community beliefs, as well as really the wider value system in society. Because psychedelic experiences are clearly embedded within larger historical and cultural context. So this kind of pharmacological reductionism common to RCTs of this by trying to isolate the drug effect may simply not be feasible, certainly not as feasible in psychedelic research. So, another thing highlighted, this is from the largest Compass Pathway trials with 233 participants. Even the authors, even within this, noted that larger studies will be needed to replicate findings. Furthermore, the study population was not fully representative of real-world patient groups. It was insufficiently ethnically diverse, very key point that we've been mentioned already quite a lot in the conference, excluded individuals judged to be current significant suicide risk. Finally, it is unknown whether other preparations of psilocybin will actually demonstrate the same effect. So very limited, as randomized controlled trials often are. So why psychedelic medicines in the real world? I think hopefully I've shown that RCTs are certainly not the only approach for researching psychedelics, given the complex interplay of substance, set, and setting. And Carl Harris termed psychedelic therapy as an inconvenient shape for traditional medical modeling, and I think that's quite a good way of putting it. And really, research needs to place psychedelics in real-world context to provide a more practical conclusion and generalizability, general results. So I'm aware that we'll start it a bit late, so I think we still have to stick to our time. Couple of things, three things I also wanted to add in terms of the further reasons we should include real-world evidence and more naturalistic approaches, the safety of psychedelics. Physiologically, psychedelics tend to be reasonably safe. Plenty of studies have shown psychedelics have been used both in kind of subcultural context and in traditional indigenous communities since a very long time. So physiologically, they don't present a risk of other, I guess, completely novel drugs. Psychologically, I think that's still a different question in terms of detrimental long-term effect that people might have. Again, some of these long-term effects, although they're very rare, I should say, have been shown to only show up after quite a while, after weeks and months even. Again, a case for real-world evidence, I would say. And we can do this real-world evidence. I'll give an example afterwards as well in terms of basically psychedelics are available and have been available, or the kind of scheduling of psychedelics as a class 1 substance, or the psychedelics as an illegal substance obviously have not stopped their availability in the real world. And there is actually a recent study, American study, really clearly showed that there has been quite a stark increase of use in naturalistic settings, possibly related to the positive effects people have been hearing about from the clinical studies and so on, which brings with it a completely different area of kind of safety and effectiveness as well, but that's not for this discussion. And then the kind of knowledges that are already existing. These are the knowledges I wanted to speak about quickly that we already have kind of here in the West, but also kind of traditional indigenous knowledges who have used various psychedelic substances for a very long time. And these are things we can draw about and we should really pay attention to and be humble that our way of knowing might not be the only way. Going to go through this in terms of the availability. I did speak about this. I think whilst I highlight that it's obviously important to capitalize on that, I also want to stress that it's really important to, when we have these developments, such as in Colorado and various US states, in Canada, in Australia recently, kind of retreat centers in Netherlands, Costa Rica, Jamaica, and plenty more, I think it is really important to actually conduct systematic and rigorous research. So that's one thing that we do want to highlight in relation to real-world evidence as well. Again, the value of incorporating non-clinical knowledges, as I already mentioned, it's not just the indigenous communities, but also the Western non-clinical subcultures, so to say, which can really shed light on various ways of harm reduction and which, show us how psychedelics are actually already being used in the real world. And, we have the opportunities to learn, and we should take it from there as well. Moving on to the various real-world evidence approaches, I won't have time to go into that in too much detail, and I think Michael will refer to them, especially the real-world approaches, real-world evidence approaches, in a bit more detail. We have loads of data on psychedelics, and it's actually really interesting that to see this more and more being used by all the, top universities and such, all the, involvement in kind of whether these are field studies, surveys, as well as many more. I find retreat and ceremony studies. I mean, Simon Ruffel in the UK is, for example, doing excellent work, actually going to Peru to basically research ayahuasca in the ceremonial settings, but I suppose with Western background, with the Western medicine background, with bringing various testing equipment and applications there. So loads of good things going on. I think David is going to speak about citizen science as well. So we have a lot of things that we can go through. And let's not forget, whilst case studies or N=1 studies, yes, they're very small, and certainly, they might not show us causality, but a lot of the psychedelic trials we're seeing at the moment also always start with something, with somebody having actually had the experience and having reported these experiences, and maybe a pattern of evidence has been building up in a real world context before moving on to the RCT evidence. I think I have time just to go quickly to give an example. Obviously, Australia, as most of you will know, is another example where hopefully data on MDMA and psilocybin will be collected starting right now. Therapsil in Canada, Health Canada has allowed a special access program since January 2020 for psilocybin and MDMA. For, I think, generally terminally ill patients, and their data will be provided to regulatory bodies such as Health Canada, and data will be analyzed fully with health-related outcomes, which the number of patients are increasing at the moment. So we have, by the time, this is provided by my dear colleague Jane Spun, I should say, the first 100 patients have input their health-related outcome measures into their system. So very promising. They're actually expecting this to double by the end of the year. And this registry documents not just the clinical effectiveness and the safety, but also patient-reported outcomes. So yeah, so very interesting, and I think, or hopefully this will be done properly. This is a very useful and interesting way of collecting real-world data. One thing that came out already, for example, through this study, that this process is really hugely labor-intensive. Barriers to the prescription included the cost associated with treatments because the patients still have to pay for the therapies, and also, and importantly, prescribers' complete lack of confidence in psychedelic therapy, as well as concerns about litigation. So again, this highlights the importance of actually looking at in a real-world setting, because these things would not have been shown in a randomized controlled trial. This is Australia. Happy to discuss this after as well. So the benefits of real-world evidence, I think, are clear. I hope I outlined this. Very happy to discuss in our panel a bit more as well. Of course, there are significant limitations which need to be, included. Key, of course, is the quality of data, because real-world evidence often relies on a completeness of data collected from the real-world sources. So this needs to be done consistently as well. So absolutely vital to obviously address limitations as well. And in conclusions, I think we find that in relation to psychedelic research, the benefits of including real-world evidence certainly outweigh the limitations. And we think that real-world evidence can offer a helpful way forward to complement RCTs and address some of the challenges that are outlined before. And I think key is here as well, it's not either or. We're absolutely not arguing against RCTs. We're really arguing for a way to complement RCTs to present different lenses on psychedelics. Our real-world evidence can better show us how psychedelics will actually be used in the real world rather than just in the clinical trials. And there's much to be learned outside the clinical context as well. Again, I think we can't stress this enough. Equipoise and humility, the humbleness, and it's required by all of us involved in the field. And to understand the full complexity of psychedelic medicines, we need innovation in clinical research, practice, and ethics. And I just wanted to relate back to the confidence. When we're thinking psychedelics, we also should be rethinking psychedelic research. So thank you very much. These are our details from drug science. I'm nice to move to the next speaker. Okay, so we're moving on to, do you know how to change this? Yeah. Okay, to Michael Linsky.
Talk on that. Hi, is this working? Can everyone hear me okay? We'll take that as a yes. My name is Michael Linsky. I work with Anna. My conflict slides are actually the same as Anna's, and I've got to include them in terms of I work at drug science. My background is more as an epidemiologist and as a data analyst. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the opportunities for psychedelic research within the context of changes that are happening really in the process of licensing drugs and difficulties that are emerging and being recognized in pharmaceutical licensing, which I think certainly apply to psychedelics as well. And I would sort of make the argument that maybe it's a time to really rethink how the whole licensing process goes about for medicines. It is very time consuming. The graph down the bottom suggests that it's at least 11 years, but typically up to about 20 years from identification of a drug to licensing of that drug. It can be incredibly expensive. A 2018 a paper estimated that in the US, the costs are close to $1 billion. That's median costs. So that just sort of seems like it's a little bit broken. A lot of it relies on, I mean, in psychedelics, we've got to jump on everything because we've already identified the drug, of course. But then once it gets to clinical trials, it relies very, very heavily, as Anna has said, on evidence from RCTs. These have advantages in terms of essentially a high degree of internal validity and control for potential sources of confounding. But there are a number of limitations. As evidence of that, about a third of new drugs licensed between 2000 and 2010 had changes to the licensing regulations made after they had entered the market. Basically, post-marketing surveillance identified various problems. Several of them were withdrawn from the market because of safety concerns. Other sort of black box type warnings were included, given emerging evidence from post-marketing surveillance, real-world evidence of concerns that had not been identified in RCTs. as I said, this is not really something, these concerns aren't necessarily being driven by psychedelic researchers, they certainly apply, but there is a broader recognition, and this is just some quotes from Sir Michael Rawlins, who had been chair of NICE in the UK, really arguing that we need to move on, there are better ways of doing things than reliance on RCTs. He identified these essential problems with them. I think I've sort of covered resources. They're time-consuming, they're expensive. Sometimes they might be unnecessary. There are drugs that have an immediate and dramatic effect. I think it's actually the case that antibiotics never went through formal RCTs because essentially it would be unethical. They were working. It may also be impossible simply due to the very small numbers of people. So some of the work that Anna has done more focused on cannabis, looking at childhood epilepsy, those epilepsies can be incredibly rare, and it's just not possible to identify a cohort large enough to complete a randomized controlled trial. There's also problems of generalizability, largely due to the very often quite stringent exclusion criteria that are used in RCTs, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that shortly. This is a outdated example, but the small ends, and again I want to talk about that often, and I'll be mentioning it later, the evidence base from RCTs is often based on relatively small numbers of people. So the number of people who have been participants in randomized controlled trials is quite small and vastly smaller than the number of people who have used these drugs. This is where, and I think real-world evidence is coming into its own, partly because of technological advancements. So when I trained in the Department of Child Psychiatry, and the landmark study at that stage was conducted by Michael Rutter in the Isle of Wight, looking at childhood behavioural disturbance. It was done in the 1960s, and he analysed the data with pen and paper. So people would fill out questionnaires, and then he would go through and he would look, if this pile was those from males and this was from females, he'd count up how many in each, and then he would do a chi-square with pencil and paper. I worked in, well, I didn't work there till the 1990s, so I'm not that old, but I worked in the Christchurch longitudinal study of general health. I'm a really sort of fairly rough programmer, and I just put the program and run it and see what happens, because that's what error messages are for. The statistician I worked there, it used to drive him crazy, because when he started on that project, which had 1,000 people, so not really that big, he would do, all the computing was done with card systems. He would enter it in his office, which was in the centre of Christchurch, very near that middle photo, and then he would bike to the main campus of the university, which was 3 miles away, and if he'd made an error in the programming, there'd be a single sheet of paper that said error, and he'd have to bike 3 miles back to his office, fix the error, and bike back. So he was really, really careful about programming. And it shows the limitations of, how new computing is. And now, honestly, working with samples of millions, I've done work with hospital episode statistics in the UK, which has data on over 50 million people, and basically it can be analysed on a laptop. There's also a lot of development, I think, happening around really sort of big data and AI. And this is where really, I think, real-world data is going to come into its own. Specifically to psychedelics, we're not really talking about something new. A lot of the processes I described are really aimed at molecules that are sort of dreamt up in someone's petri dish or computer. But we already know a lot about psychedelics. I think it's useful, though, to distinguish between the source of data, whether that's real world or not. So real world data might be health insurance claims in the US, or, as I said, hospital episode data in the UK, versus the source of the drug, which may be an RCT, or it may be in naturalistic or real-world settings. Anna's already mentioned some of the real-world settings that are emerging in Australia and Canada, and there is also, of course, naturalistic use, which has been going on for a very long time. It's already you can link real-world data to RCT data, and this is the example here, where it's really just post-marketing surveillance. Increasingly, the FDA is demanding post-marketing surveillance of all drugs entering the market. Other real-world data on naturalistic use, I think, really has established what we know. These drugs are really quite safe. And a little dig, it was mentioned last night during the keynote speech about NICE and different organizations which look at the funding of research and how their decisions may be quite different from the decisions from RCTs. So in the UK, the MHRA has licensed esketamine for use. I know it's not really a psychedelic, but I think it's useful to look at in this case. So it's licensed for use, but NICE has decided that they will not fund it. And part of their reason for not funding it is because they've identified what they perceive as problems with the design of the RCTs, which were used to gain licensing for that drug. So to get licensed, they had to impose quite strict exclusion criteria. They did that, the drug got licensed, but then the funders said, oh, you had exclusion criteria, so we're not going to fund use of the drug. So yeah, it's a sort of catch-22 situation. Again, recognition of these issues is not sort of new or unique. Now, very quickly, I wanted to run through, because I mainly work on T21, which is a real-world registry of medicinal cannabis. And I think it illustrates several sorts of points, advantages of these registries, which can potentially be capitalized on in places where, such as Canada and Australia, where psychedelics are becoming legal. So medicinal cannabis is legal in the UK, but it is not funded by NICE. I mean, it's background. I'll go very quickly. We established a registry of patients seeking treatment for a variety of conditions. We had no exclusion criteria on who could be in the study. Individual doctors decided whether or not their patient might benefit from cannabis and whether or not they were prepared to prescribe it. And we then sort of separately collected some data, including self-report data on how they went over time. So far, we've collected data on close to 4,000 people. About half of the sample in our study have chronic pain. The total number of people with chronic pain who've been in RCTs of cannabis is about 4,000. So we're up to about half of what's ever been done in trials for looking at effects of cannabis on pain. And also, we have the longer term follow-up, which is just the point of all those numbers. In other talks, I would just give loads and loads of data, which basically all show the same of these. People with anxiety disorders who seek treatment with medicinal cannabis report a considerable reduction in their symptoms of anxiety. The same thing happens for people with chronic pain and for people with PTSD and other conditions. They also report substantial improvements in quality of life, sleep, and mood. Finally, and back to the point that both Anna and I have made about exclusion criteria, I wanted to talk a little bit about PTSD in our sample. So in our sample, the cannabis sample, and in many countries with medicinal cannabis, PTSD is one of the most common conditions for which people are seeking treatment. despite that, there's really very little evidence. There's been a total of 87 people have been participants in clinical trials. One of those trials didn't assess PTSD symptomatology. The other trial showed no difference between placebo and cannabis. We actually reported quite a substantial improvement, but also, and back to the point about exclusion criteria, the improvement was greater in people with comorbid depression. And so one of the dangers of exclusion criteria as they're used in RCTs is that they may enroll a sample who not only are unrepresentative of the people who would seek that treatment, but may actually select for people who are least likely to benefit from that treatment. And that's all I had.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Oh, good. Yes, good. And I think this should still be on for you.
Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for staying. Now there's the last presentation, and then there will be, questions and discussion instead of these presentations. So I will be so when I hear the theme citizen science and what do I know about that? Obviously, I come from a lab in London where we do more sort of conventional lab-based studies where we include people on typically quite limited restrictive criteria because they're small, so they need to be kind of homogeneous in order for us to be able to conclude much. So that is most of what we're doing. So that's expensive, very labor-intensive and complex trials to run that are relatively small. So they have all the issues that you are talking to, even more than a lot of the clinical trials done at the moment. But our aim typically is very mechanistic, very neuroscience-y, so maybe it's okay. We can't do real-world neuroscience. It's complicated, at least. But the most obvious example of what we have been doing is our work with microdosing. So I will get back into that as an example. But before I do that, I'll show a bit more broad how we, in addition to the work at Imperial with lab-based trials, we have created years ago a platform called Psychedelic Surveys. Now it's sort of changed a bit, so it's not sitting on that platform, but this idea is the same, that we also try to harvest data from real world to, in a way, to some degree exploit that these drugs obviously have a big culture and history and use outside of the labs and outside of the medicinal development that we are tapping into by doing surveys. And if you have conventional trials like RCTs, randomized controlled trials, the good thing about them is that they have, despite some of the weaknesses that also Anne was mentioning, they have, at least compared to sort of pragmatic real-world data, some degree of high internal validity. On the other side, typically very small. They can be very advanced in the designs, which you can't as easily do in real world because you are not in control of the conditions. But in the real world data collection, you have advantages of external validity and a more diverse sample, which is exactly what Michael was talking about, and also a diverse and potentially more ecologically valid setting. So you can get up in high numbers when you do citizen science real world data collection, and try to meet some of those limitations that are in the smaller, highly controlled but also restrictive trial setting. So just as a reason is, for a lot of reasons we are doing this work and collecting data this way. And an extra sort of bonus reason is that it's easier and there's more data to collect because people are actually using the compounds more. So there's simply also a more rich pool of data to tap into. And more recently, you have even more interesting data to tap into, which is the Oregon, Canada, Swiss, Australia, where it is not sort of the undergroundy naturalistic, but it sort of sits in between. It's more clinical real use that is not in the format of a trial. So you have, in a way, 3 different places you can collect data from: conventional, lab-based, or RCTs with all the restrictions and the high costs. Then you have the real-world programs that are now happening more and more. And then you have, normal naturalistic real-world use of the drugs. And that's unique for these compounds, right? That does not happen. It's not that when whatever pharma company was developing whatever SSRI, that they could also, in the meantime, collect data from people already using it everywhere. That is a privilege of this. And that's also why we feel in some degree some responsibility of trying to harvest knowledge and generate hypotheses from this kind of work. So you can see it's easier because there's more use, not only more use, but also more people seeding retreats. That means we can also collaborate with retreats and try to collect data from at sort of semi-structured, rather than people sitting in their bedroom taking the psychedelics and filling out our survey. This in collaboration with retreats, we can also collect data, and that has obviously also become more popular to do over the last years. So we have a number of surveys. These are some of them. We also have holotropic breathwork now. So Joe Peel was in the room. He just left, but he's setting up a cold water one. And also we have 5-MeO. We have different surveys that are not listed right here, but I'll mainly be speaking about these ones. The idea is that they are prospective. So if you do real world, you can do retrospective. Basically, have you ever, blah, blah, how was it? Collect a lot of data. That's better than just asking one person to do that to a lot of people in a survey. But it's still not particularly brilliant science because it'll be deeply confounded and in a very sort of selected group of people. You should be careful of concluding too much of that kind of data. It's still valuable and interesting to generate hypotheses. Then you can do prospective, where you at least have people sign up for it and consent to it before they start engaging in the behavior, in this case, taking psychedelics. And then you follow them from before to around the time they're doing it and afterwards, right? That's prospective. So that's what our platform is doing. So if people are planning to take a psychedelic on their own initiative, then they can consent and tick the boxes for online consent and then fill out over time these surveys with all the, often way too many, I would say, questionnaires. And then we can do it, a specific one with Hannes Kettner, a PhD student who is approaching the end of his PhD. He's now with Robin Cardo in San Francisco, but he is still an Imperial PhD student. He has been doing a lot of the survey work and is set up this ceremony survey, where this is people who actually are doing it in a more ceremonial guided group context. So it's two aspects of this online prospective data collection. So when we do that, no matter whether it's one or the other, as you can see, we do baseline before, and then at different time points, we collect these online data from the trials. So one not in a ceremonial context, one in. And as you can see here, the beauty is that the numbers are not in the millions, it's not in the thousands even, but it's in the hundreds. And that is more than doing a study in 12 people in a lab or in 25 people, or our largest trial we have done was 59, the escitalopram versus psilocybin depression trial. That's still just for 59 people. Here you get up in 10 times that number, which is great. But you see another thing that actually is an issue, and that is the dropout, the attrition rate. People drop out of these surveys. Part of it, our own fault, because we put way too many questionnaires in there, and that people get so sick of it and fed up and can't be bothered to do it when we ask them for the 6th time to fill out. So they drop out over time. That's a problem. So we can then look at baseline. Do they seem to be different from the people who didn't drop out? That's some reassurance. But the thing is, we don't know what happened to them. If they drop out at any point during, we simply don't know. We can't reconstruct it. And that is not brilliant scientifically. So that's a big Achilles heel in doing this kind of work, that you have that dropout of quite significant size. But we can then look at the characteristics of the surveys and these numbers. At least this is the total N at baseline. And so we can see that when people do it in ceremonies, then there tend to be more women doing that in terms of proportionally. People tend to be a bit older, and there tend to be more psychedelic naive people, so who haven't tried psychedelics, who would do it in a ceremonial context. Can't completely conclude, but that's how it looks from these survey data that we have. And then, not that surprisingly, people don't tend to do LSD ceremonies. I don't know whether, I'm sure that happens somewhere, but that's not typical. So it's more like ayahuasca, psilocybin when it's in the ceremonial context. Not surprising either. And this is just to show that in terms of scientific value, for us, it has great value because we are able to look at a lot of different things, and that we have done. So we have published a lot of papers, and this is not at all the papers published from our survey work. This is just from these two of the largest ones of the work. So we can zoom in on connectedness aspects of the data set and setting, and also try to look for prediction of response. We can also validate new scales, like emotional breakthrough can be validated in this way, which we also did. So Leo Roseman's EBI measure, nature relatedness, there's more coming out of our surveys on that as well. So a lot of different things. Personality measures, because we can put in validated measures of personality onto the surveys and follow them over time, and then look at that in greater numbers than we can in our small trials in the lab. And then also zooming in on the important part here, the issue about the attrition. So there's also a paper on that. And then we can also do a zoom in and look at, obviously this is naturalistic, right? So it can be anybody signing up for this, but within that group, there will be people who are a little bit more depressed than the average. So we can then go for the people who at baseline had some degree of depression in the self-rated, and then zoom in there and then have a naturalistic depression kind of trial, non-controlled, but you still have pre and post data. So that we also did, and that in a way is showing data in the same size as are seen in the RCTs for effects on depressive symptoms. So a lot of different data, and just to make it even worse, there's all this on its way. And again, this is not even the full picture, because this is just from these two data sets, and there's even more than this listed here. So tons of different things. But remember the attrition. Remember also that we are obviously using the same pool of data for a lot of different things, and that's why we have all the scales. It would also be stupid not to come out with all the data when we have bothered people. It would almost be unethical not to actually look at it and try to. But obviously, the degree to which you can conclude is questionable because of the quality of this kind of data. Then I'll jump into, actually now completely no clue about the time. How I have, okay. So a specific example related to microdosing that I think will maybe open for some concern, caution about some of the real world data in the psychedelic space. So just briefly, why study microdosing? Is it even relevant? We can know from PET data, occupancy of the 2A serotonin 2A receptor, that microdosing seems to actually bind to enough receptors to pharmacologically, theoretically, be having a pharmacological effect. So that's one reason to take microdosing serious and actually want to study it, because we can see that the doses people are calling and using as microdoses, they are pharmacologically more mini doses and actually have significant occupancy on the receptors where the psychedelics work. So therefore, and also not only that, but in particular all the anecdotes, the best-selling books, the hype, the amazing things that people report about microdosing. This is some highlights out there that has been claimed to be benefits coming from microdosing. So because that exists, that narrative is there, the stories are there, the anecdotes are there, and pharmacologically, we can see maybe it can work because of the doses people are actually using. Therefore, we said, yes, let's study it. And then back to the survey. So we did that first in this survey. Laura Kertner, who was moderating, she actually right now is still moderating, I think, a session in the other room. She set this one up with us, or did that while she was a student with us, and that was a prospective survey. Don't go too crazy here, it's just to show the timeline. So it was over 4 weeks, and as I mentioned, it's prospective, so we collect stuff at baseline, and then over the course of the period where people are on their own initiative with their own drug, wherever they are in the world, as long as they have consented and signed up to the online platform, microdosing, right? So that's a neat prospective approach. And when we did that, you can see that the stuff you want to go up goes up, and the stuff you want to go down goes down. So basically, WemWeb's well-being increases, great. Quits, that's depression, goes down. Anxiety, Spielberger, goes down. So that's in a way saying, okay, looks like there's good benefits of microdosing. So that's great in this prospective study. So it's still better than anecdotes and better than retrospective. Also, other things that significantly changed over the course of the 4 weeks here: resilience, social connectedness, nature relatedness, agreeableness, emotional stability, all in a positive direction in this survey. Great. But then what about the whole thing about, let's think about placebo, let's be careful. What about expectation effects? Could it drive it? So when we look at expectations, then there was a relationship between having positive expectations for the effects of the microdosing and the actual outcome. So that's a bit of an issue, and we can't do anything about it because there's no control condition, right? But this is naturalistic work. And also just to complete this thing about expectancy, just to mention as a curiosity, completely stepping away from the topic, but just to mention it, we have actually also looked at expectancy effects in our depression trial, which is a controlled lab-based trial, and we didn't see a relationship between expectancy towards effect of psilocybin in the depressed trial, and the depressed people in the depression trial. So just to mention that. There was higher expectations overall for the effects of psilocybin. Not surprisingly, if you go into a trial at this point in history where you're comparing an SSRI versus a psilocybin, people will go in having quite high expectations about the psychedelic. But that did not associate with the outcomes in this trial for psilocybin. So what did we do after Laura Kertner's trial? We then, together with Balashigeti, did this self-blinding version of the microdosing trial, which is, again, this is proper citizen science, because this is even more involvement of the real world people out in the real world. They had to do quite an effort. So they were basically our investigators. So we just allowed the manual, the platform, the online thing, and we could also send them some capsules and things to actually implement the method of blinding themselves. So not making themselves blind, but blinding themselves to what they were doing, what condition they were under. So basically, people could then, if they followed the manual, they would put their own drug and whatever regime they were planning to do with their microdosing for this 1 month period, they could create that. But they did it by following our manual, and our manual allowed us, we were not there, them, to basically replace their planned microdoses with placebo. So they could be sitting in Buenos Aires and plan their microdoses, but following this, then they might actually have replaced it all with placebo. So when we had this ethically approved, because everybody was saying this is never going to be approved. I mean, even David Nutt said, no, you're interfering with something naturalistic that ethics cannot approve. But to the ethics committee, what we said was that the only thing we're doing is, the only thing we're doing is potentially replacing their psychedelic with nothing. How can that be particularly unethical? We're still letting them do what they're, but the only interference is that we might replace it with nothing. How bad can that be? And they could just see the penny drop, and they were like, yeah, okay. So we got it approved against everybody's expectation, actually. So people then did that and ended up then in one of 3 groups, placebo group, so they would just have the whole thing replaced by placebo for the 4-week period. 1 envelope was 1 week, so 4 envelopes, and then the other 4 envelopes was discarded. following this manual, they had 8 envelopes, and then they used the 4, and then either they ended up with placebo or a mix or microdosing, right? So they ended up in 3 different groups. And this is, an overview of the three different groups. Without going into detail, they improved. One outcome was mindfulness over the 4 weeks, and there's also an extra 4-week follow-up. And there's a beautiful, significant increase in mindfulness, okay? And the issue is that there also was in the placebo group. So this is now naturalistic, prospective, citizen science work, but it has placebo in there for no money, by the way. A very little money, but a lot of time of Balázs Szigeti in particular, and also some other people. And then you see the same pattern basically emerging, that there is not really a separating effect accumulative over the time of the trial. So then what about on the day where people did their microdose? The one thing is what happens accumulative over the 4-week period. But if you zoom in at each day, because we also had questions, each day, how are you feeling? And what do you think you took? And we knew what they took because we have these QR codes and we had the information sitting in the background that they didn't have about what they actually did, because they scanned in the QR code from the envelopes, and we could then see what they were taking. So they didn't know what they were taking, or did they? Some of them maybe did, because they might feel the effect of the microdose. Okay, so when we looked at the acute data on the days where they took it, we could see, there's actually a proper significant effect here of the microdosing condition. But the thing is, if they actually took placebo, then they had this effect. If they took microdosing but accidentally guessed it was placebo, there's not effect. So this is people taking a microdose but thinking it was a placebo wrongly, because we collect that information. Then there is not an effect. And if they actually took placebo but wrongly thought this is a microdose, then you have the effect. So the first I showed you on the previous slide was just that one and that one, but look at the 2 other ones. And this is where you can get trapped in scientific data, because you see an effect of the placebo, you see an effect of the expectancy here, and the breaking of the blind in some cases. So basically, I'm not going to go into too much detail. This is overall a pattern of the trial. So basically here we are then moving up in the hierarchy of evidence, because down there you have anecdotes, then you have something that is uncontrolled, and the more you move up towards proper randomized controlled trial, the stronger it is evidence-wise, with the issues that we heard about earlier. So with this design that is, as said, cheap, naturalistic, citizen science, but still placebo control, we are moving up in the hierarchy. Then you have 2 other trials that have done similar. They haven't done it, they have done more expensive versions. The Chicago team with DeWitt, and the Australian team, New Zealand team in healthy people. So these are healthy people for the 2 other groups. So those trials are now using not a single dose, but repeated dosing, and with placebo control. And so we are moving up in the hierarchy. Then let's take a look at the overall full overview of the data in microdosing, because this is where it gets problematic, I think. If you do that, you look at affective symptoms, so depression, anxiety, well-being kind of thing. All the work ever done with microdosing. Green is when there's significantly proposed benefits for microdosing in the data set. Red is if it's a bad effect, and white is if there's not really either. There's no significant anything. So you see that it looks very good and promising and supportive, beneficial for microdosing, but the problem is that it's in the bottom of the hierarchy of evidence. So if the more control condition you apply, the more the green disappears. And that means that real-world data, naturalistic data is great, it's important, has all the benefits we talked about, but you see, if you only do it like this, you'll end up concluding that microdosing, for instance, have great benefits. So therefore, the combination, and this is the full overview, where you have all of it together, you see the issue that you should be careful about, we should be careful about concluding And then you can say, so I was thinking during the other talks that I think that the real world data carry a lot of value for the full doses, and when they're coming out in these different places and centers of the world to collect data there on larger scale and with more real world people with comorbidities and so on. If that's done right, that's really valuable. When it comes to microdosing, actually I would say there we should be a bit careful about the real world data, because that you have the privilege and therefore also the responsibility of doing it thoroughly, and you can placebo control a bloody microdose. That's the whole, so there you should probably be a bit more in the conventional direction, because you have methodologically the ability to do it, and you see what happens when you do it. You get a bit surprised if you are like reading tons of papers, concluding from whatever scientists and other people who are saying that it's amazing. That's because they're looking at this data. So therefore, as great as real world data is, also take it with a grain of salt, and sometimes it may be that it should be used for hypothesis generation, and then be tested in more controlled trials, in particular when it comes to something like microdosing. So that's where I think I'll leave it. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for a very dense and very thorough presentation. I'm sure there are loads of questions. We've got a mic, I think, to go round. Is that correct? Yeah? Do I just bring this round? I think so. Okay, you can do that. Thank you.
Hi. If expectations influence the perceived effect and well-being and reduction in symptoms, shouldn't we just be giving placebo or microdosing and saying that it works because it adds real better life quality for the patients?
Hello? Yeah. So, I mean, maybe Michael also have comments on it. That in a way it's logical to say that, first of all, giving placebo is incredibly safe, right? It does not have any affinity, placebo, for the 2B receptor that sits in the heart. That is one of the concerns about, for instance, microdosing, right? That if you use that for that long and you keep on stimulating a bit your 2B receptor, could it do bad stuff on your heart valves? So therefore, a placebo is, but I would say that if you want to sell and make a brilliant business, who cares? Then sell microdose. A lot of people are doing that, right? If you are a medical licensed professional, then that's just not good enough. You can't sit and sell placebo. That's just how it is. That's part of the oath we put, and that's also how the whole thing is regulated. If it doesn't work beyond placebo, it doesn't have a proper future in medicine. Then it will stay in the alternative space, and then, like so many other things in the alternative space, it will be maybe mainly a placebo thing, but it will happen outside the regulated medicinal space. And that would be the case for microdosing if that holds true, that there is not much beyond placebo. Then, of course, all the work that is being done could shoot down a bit of the placebo effect, right? Because the more people hear that, then it will take some of the expectancy out. But regulators, they care about whether it works beyond placebo. And they are actually the one deciding whether this should come as a medicine, right? So it will never come as medicine if it has an amazing placebo. The reason why it has such a big placebo effect, I mean, you can ask back, why do people think the effect is so amazing? Probably because it's deeply hyped. You are a cool person in your Google headquarters, at least a few years ago, if you were the one microdosing. You are interesting in the lunch break. You start becoming vegan as well. You start doing yoga and mindfulness. It's tons of lifestyle changes that follow. It's a complete lifestyle. It's deeply hyped. You read one amazing book, a bestseller about. It's so hyped, so popular. It's a pop phenomenon that, of course, the placebo effect is max. The expectancy is max. So if that dies out a bit, then you'll probably have a placebo effect that's a bit more normal, which is still there, but that's just not good enough for regulators. Also, if you're an investor, it's not good enough either. You don't want to pay you do want to pay massive trials because you want to be sure that I'm right. And I'm not claiming that it's placebo. I'm just saying so far it looks like that. I will never put my head on the block and say there's no effects of microdosing. I'm just saying a lot of it seems to be very driven by placebo at this point. But yeah, that's $1 million question, right? Why isn't placebo enough? It just isn't for the investors, isn't for the regulators, isn't for the medics, and therefore it will stay out of the conventional field.
That covers it, yeah.
Hello, thank you to all of the speakers for your interesting presentations. I have a methodological question. So as you showed the evidence hierarchy pyramid, I was curious. So we know that for RCTs we have systematic reviews and meta-analysis. Are there equivalent methods for real-world evidence study designs?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are. In fact, they're very, very similar. The mechanics of doing a systematic review sort of almost don't vary between whether it's real world or RCTs. I think the thing is, and a meta-analysis of real-world data, I think, is stronger than an individual real-world data thing. So I showed some of our cannabis data. If that gets replicated in other studies, whether it's in the UK or here or wherever, that becomes stronger, and the meta-analysis can give more precision to the effects. It can look at subgroups within that with more precision, but it's still a little bit down because it's a meta-analysis of real-world data. So sort of maybe you need to have a second pyramid beside it or something, where there's certainly the advantages of that approach, but there's still issues about RCTs.
Sorry, I don't need. No, just to add to that as well, in terms of what the regulators require in terms of real-world evidence, obviously we're nowhere near that yet. I mean, we can present all the best real-world evidence as we're trying to do for cannabis, as loads of people globally actually are doing for cannabis, and we've got thousands upon thousands of patients, but very often this is not sufficient in terms of the perceived quality of evidence to persuade or really connect with regulators. So yeah, I think that's a key thing as well. Next question, the lady.
In all the research that I see on using psychedelics, they talk about set and setting. So how, when you're using microdosing, do you even consider the setting or the treatment or who they're doing it with? Is that even in consideration when you're looking at microdosing?
Great question. David, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, there's much less attention and perceived importance to set and setting when it comes to microdosing. So people tend to just be getting on with their life, and typically these lifestyle changes are typically associated with it. But people still, it's not that they sit in a deeply spiritual, sacred space with amazing music and a dim light and two Buddhas, and they just go to work in Google or wherever they go to work. So there's, and that's also because it is so much easier. You don't have that altered state that can be challenging and difficult. That's the whole point. That's why it's so appealing, that if there are proper benefits of microdosing, it's an amazingly appealing model that sits between the interesting aspects of psychedelics and completely conventional, take a medication very regular and get on with your life and go to work, but be better at it and feel better and, feel better emotionally and so on. So there's not that much attention to set and setting. Are we collecting any specific data and microdosing about it? I don't even really know exactly. Not in the same rigid way as we do for the big doses, where people really pay attention to the settings. So typically people just get on. Also, if you had to sit in a very sacred space and you're doing it 3 days a week with LSD, you'll run out of being able to pay your rent, right? Because you are spending all your time in that sacred space. And anyway.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I have something that comes up a lot, both yesterday during the introduction and today is that learning from, of course, there's like an insufficient. It feels like there is insufficient learning from, like you're all talking about both subcultural settings and indigenous settings. But it also feels like maybe the reason for that is what happens when as our public health systems look in many countries in the West, what happens when you learn from these settings is that you get a lot of like David said, it's good to exploit this this knowledge and experience that they have, but the problem is that what happens when it comes into the academic setting and also into the public health system is that all this knowledge is in a way appropriated, so that it gets translated into a different two things, a different way of talking about these things. So you take the knowledge and experience from these people, and then you translate it to an academic language, which in a sense disqualifies a lot of the epistemological perspectives that come from these settings, but also that taking the knowledge from these people or receiving knowledge from them and then still not pushing for, let's say, letting them also be allowed to use the things. I feel like it's an ethical problem that is, like, in a sense, like a continuation of some sort of colonialism or something, where you get all this knowledge and then you still say, but it's only the licensed practitioners that are allowed to use these things and so on. What do you guys have to thoughts about that?
Different discussions there, but I have loads of thoughts about this, and I'm happy to discuss more afterwards. And I do believe, I think after lunch there is actually a session on that, on the indigenous practices. Hopefully I didn't miss it yet. So absolutely. So yeah, absolutely, very important points you're raising, I think, and I think we need to clearly distinguish also between the subcultural Western uses, since that many of you have been doing or continuing to do, as well as the really indigenous traditional uses in cultures and in societies which have been traditionally suppressed, where they really, the use or the, as I say, maybe taking of psychedelics from these cultures, indigenous tribes, is just another way of extracting something from these cultures. Could also be oils or precious metals or anything that the West is also taking from them. And psychedelics really are a small part of that. I think, it's not nothing, unfortunately, fortunately, it's not as significant at all as other areas that we, speaking of the West, have been taking from these cultures. We've actually written a paper on that as well, which also parts I'm very happy to share that as well, in terms of really developing a communication and incorporation, not just of the psychedelics, but also of their knowledge, of their traditions, but really relating, together with these communities, again, kind of making the point for real world evidence there. So really we had as an example, online focus groups with indigenous leaders, with Spanish or Portuguese translators, and really one of us is hopefully going to be published later this year. So we're really working on that, and I personally feel really strongly about that too. And rather than saying psychedelics are just another part of where we as the West are taking from these communities, we really at Drug Science, we hope to actually make a point in terms of actually, let's use psychedelics as an example where this can be done correctly, where this can be really done with a lot of humility. And thankfully, the researchers we work with, the vast majority of the researchers and scientists, I'm not speaking about the slightly bigger industry names here, are very much in favor of that, just for the learning. So I'm quite positive that this can be done in a really reciprocal fashion, not just that taking, but really giving back. So, but very important points, I agree. Maybe at the back.
Thank you. Thank you for that really interesting presentation. My question's kind of linked to the one that just came before. I guess I'm just curious to know, in your opinion, as people who work in Western medicine, bridging that with real world experiences of psychedelics, how weird and how freaky are you all willing to get? Real world psychedelics is kind of strange. You can meet aliens, you can meet spirits, there are plant spirits. For me, that's kind of a lot of the paths that the real world use of psychedelic takes you, ceremonially, ritualistically. So kind of wanting to bridge the two, how kind of freaky are you willing to get? And how irrational, I think I'm interested to know, how irrational is Western medical science willing to get?
For me as well. I've got this one. I thought that was working, but if not, it's not working. Okay, don't worry. So David Luke is not here, just speaking of the weird and DMT studies. So David Luke is one of our dear colleagues, part of our medical psychedelics working group as well as drug science, professor at Greenwich University in the UK with really an extensive knowledge, both of psychedelics himself, but also in terms of conducting these real-world studies. If you're interested in that, I would highly recommend. He's just published this summer a series of 3 DMT studies, really DMT in naturalistic environments. Again, these are people who would have consumed DMT anyway, and I think he interviewed them before and after and a couple of months later and so on. Absolutely fascinating findings. But anybody who's done DMT would recognize things in that, I think. But this is happening, and this is published in the scientific literature. And personally, I'm very interested in it. I do also think that developers of these modules, if that's what companies want to do, they are looking at that, they are paying attention to that, and we are absolutely, certainly very open to that.
Just as a general comment, I'd say, working in a field which is defined the way psychedelics is, I think we are all probably interested in those aspects and a variety of aspects. We're not saying that we're sociologists or that we're neuroscientists. We're studying a particular phenomenon which is informed and which informs all of those fields. And so, personally, hugely interested in that. In terms of my expertise, it doesn't really overlap, but that's bad on me. But it's certainly very interesting and very important and worthwhile.
I would say I think everybody working with psychedelics are sharing the enthusiasm and interest in what is strange and freaky and fascinating and weird. So I would say, in addition to what Anne said about Dave Luke, also in the lab we run at Imperial, we also looking at microphenomenology, sort of the details of the experience, and the brain correlates of that. There's Chris Timmerman and people working in our team are looking very much at that. It overlaps with David Luke's, but it's a very neuroscience approach to it. So the interest is definitely there. But I think, in a way, how I heard your question is more, I'm a psychiatrist as well. If I represent mental health or the NHS and the future of, then I would say, then the interest is not probably going to be massive, right? And we also need to be realistic. How psychedelic will they in a way like and allow the setting to be? How will the therapy be entity focused? I doubt it, you know what I mean? However, so at this point where it is right now, this is about getting these drugs to evidence base of efficacy and safety that can push them through the regulatory process, which is getting a square break through a round hole. They are not set in the world to approve talking therapy, so that's already a monster problem. So all that needs to be overcome. Then the details of how it will be used, how many entities are allowing to get into that treatment space, I think time will show, and hopefully there'll be beautiful, amazing therapists who will integrate different practices, and there will be different places for different clients and patients to go. But in the NHS space, with that hat on, it's probably going to be a little bit the, maybe not most colorful version of it, because otherwise it's not going to be scalable in a public health system and approve all those layers. I doubt it. That's also why we created that Cypress clinic that is not using tons of drapings and psychedelic ornamentation. It is using a bit more neutral art that is still hopefully quite appealing and interesting and organic to look at, using natural material, using light, but still lamps that are kind of normal designy, to make it pleasant and soothing and aesthetic, but without going full-blown psychedelic, because that might be difficult to scale up in the public health system. This is obviously also a controversial topic, but that's how I see it. I think we need to also be a bit realistic about who we will be coming with these treatments to in terms of systems. Yeah.
Just to say also quickly, I mean, just to add to that, the thing is the majority of patients are not going to be into psychedelics or not necessarily sharing an interest in psychedelics. So how will they want to get, what will help them the most, and how can we make sure that they're happy or comfortable to access this treatment? And they probably would not necessarily want to access it if they say, oh, we have all these entities coming to you or something. So I think all these things need to be really taken into account, and loads more work to be done. I think 2 more questions. The gentleman. Oh, you've got one already, sorry.
So much gratitude for your talks and the research, but based on the citizen science I've collected, because I moderate the microdosing subreddit, what I see is people have to titrate their dosage, because shrooms, the potency varies by up to 10 times. So if you have fixed doses, then you might not see an effect. And the Surish's new microdosing LSD trial, which is the first clinical trial for LSD, has shown there are acute benefits. And now on their second phase, what they've changed, they took 10 micrograms for the first phase, and some people had negative effects. And now in the second phase, they're titrating the dosage from 5 to 15 micrograms, and then increasing by 1 microgram each time. And then when they feel negative effects, then they down titrate.
Yeah, they did that they started doing that into the trial, I think, because they realized that the dose was maybe too high for some people. Yeah. So, but to your point, I would say the Balashiketi that we did, that doesn't have that issue at all, because people are using their own doses. So
yeah, but one thing, cause every day I find always providing advice for people, because people take too high a dose, then you have to titrate
But a
down.
lot of the people in the trial had titrated and figured out what dose they were going to go for. Okay, but you're right. It wasn't a formality, because we would not be able to put in naturalistic science like that. We would never be allowed to come with a demand of them doing that. We would not be allowed to tell people what to do at all. So we couldn't say, go home, titrate, because then we encourage them to do so. It's illegal. We cannot do it. So you're right that in a lab-based study, you have the advantage of being able to do that. So it was brilliant that team did that, so that they got around that issue of some people might take too much. But in a way, there are plus and minuses of all the designs and what you can and can't do. We would not be able to do that in naturalistic. You can't do that. You're not allowed to. But yeah, people did it, which is good. A lot of them.
Last question, the gentleman at the back.
For the usual prescription drugs, we have a worldwide network to notice adverse effects, the pharmacovigilance networks. Do our substances here have access to this network? If not, it would be a great thing, I think. Do you know if they do?
I don't know, but I mean, if you do a proper trial, right, and it's regulated and approved by the regulatory bodies, then obviously there's very strict requirements of how to collect all levels of different side effects, and they will be reported because that they have to, right? So they will be made public from all trials. Whether they end up in that system, I don't know. Eventually, you would imagine that if they get a license, then they will, I'm sure, be part of the same system. But at this point, it's in trial phase, and then you have these things like Oregon as an example. I don't know that much, but I spoke to Robin recently, Robin Carhart. He said that one thing that, now I only have it from him, it could be wrong, I could have got it wrong, he could have got it wrong, but it seemed like they're not actually having any specific requirements and formal way of collecting adverse event, which seems to be quite a miss, if you ask me, because and also in Australia, so there are also issues there, as far as I understand, of what's going to happen, because you don't have this reimbursement thought into it. That means that it will mainly be used there in private settings. If it's used in private settings, how can you force people who are competing with each other to run their little business in collecting data in a very specific way? Then that really needs to be thought carefully in this stage as well, to make sure that the data, you will know much more about what they're planning, but it could be an issue that it's not being collected. Once it's licensed, then I think it will fit into the systems and be done the same way.
Yeah, I think you sort of cover that. Most of the systems are for licensed medicines in terms of things like the UK yellow card system, and that would exclude really unlicensed drugs, including those in Oregon being used.
Okay. I think it's time for lunch. I think thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, for being so friendly, and thanks to the panelists. Thank you.